MA 220s, and that's what we use. We use kind of like the round dance cuers like to use that because they can separate the voice, and they know how to separate the voice and the music with the MA. They can do it with the 220, 205s and the 500s, but they know how they are experienced with the MAs. So we try to put the MAs in round dance halls. The MA that I got here, actually Paul Cody gave me the idea a long time ago when he ordered his MA 220 that I have got, the MAs come with one remote for your volume control. Actually, I've got two in there. It's in that stuff where you can have two people. Actually, it's 4 mic outputs, but you can have 2 people on the mic outputs have volume control. And one of the biggest things, if you have any of these pieces of equipment, is these little blue carrying cases. Get them. If you take a good close look at my 220, I didn't have it. That case there goes with that piece of equipment right there, and that looks like it's brand new. I've had it since day one. It's a 150 over here that we're using right over here. This is my yak stack here. But if you buy one, I know Paul has got a special on. Well, he runs them right around $14.95 for a new MA, and he told me that he'd take off 10% off of. He didn't pay me to do this either, so I just want to let you know he didn't pay me to do this, but he'll take 10% off any accessories that you'd like and that stuff. So, but one of the biggest things, if you have something like that, get yourself a blue case, especially if you're yak stack. Get yourself a blue case. It protects it from the weather and that stuff. I mean, most of us up north, I live in northern Illinois, it gets cold out there. So, one of the things, let's see, I wrote down notes. This is the first time I've ever done this, so excuse you. All right. Okay. One of the biggest things, placement of speakers. When you're in a festival or something like that, in a small room, like the other night we were out there, they had one, I just put down 2 yaks and that stuff. It was kind of a wide room, and then run a slave off the MA in that. You can't run 2 full yaks off an MA. The only way you can run 2 full yaks off an MA is right here. And it's a series Y in that. Some people say that sits there and affects the sound. I don't know. I've never had a problem with it. But with that person, I always put slave with it and slave with it. So placement of speakers, we'll get back to that later on. Placement of speakers up on a stage. Say you're in a big, you're doing a festival for your college association. You usually have a stage. What I do is I put a stage out. I put a full yak up on the stage, and then I put half yaks on each side. Now, a lot of times I've come in. We were at the Indiana State Convention, and they had in the big hall where they had a stage, and then they had 2 half yaks on the outside. But they had the half yaks 6 feet in front of the one on the stage. The best way that I've found, and it's not the right way. I guess this is Bob's way. it works for me. I mean, there's different ways of doing stuff, and you guys out there as callers, you have things that you probably works for you. The right back there in the back there, chair. So when I set up a sound in a big hall, I set a full set of yaks up on the stage, and me as a caller, I never like to work behind. So what I'll do is I'll put my table right alongside that yak stack. That yak stack will be on the right-hand side or the left-hand side, and it'll be right there within earshot. So where you're actually sitting right about right here. Didn't mean to walk in front of you, but you'll be right here. So where you can hear that music coming out of there, and you know that it's going to be too loud or too soft. But on the speakers, on the half yaks on each side, you put them right in line. If you got a speaker that's 10 feet, your speaker on your stage is 10 feet away from your wall, the speakers out on the outside should be 10 feet away from the wall, and that stuff. So, and the biggest, depending on how big, lots of times you have risers that come up like this. You want to make sure that speaker on the outside is at least as top as the top speaker on the main stage, and that. So you want that. Sometimes they have little sections of risers that you can use out there on the side of the round table or something like that. That works out good. But get them things up. If you have a real deep hall, the higher you get them yak stacks, and yes, I am. Somebody said something about another speaker. I am a yak stack person. I have not yet found a hall that I cannot sound with a yak stack. It depends on a lot of the things to where you set them in different places and that stuff. A lot of times, too, the higher you get that sound, the better off you are in a big hall. If you got a lot of sound, a hall has a lot of reverberation. The biggest thing is go into the hall beforehand and sit out in the middle of it and clap and sit there and see how many seconds that clap carries out, and you'll know if that clap goes right dead, then you got a pretty good hall to sound. If that clap keeps on reverberating out, you got problems. For my suggestion to do something like that, now you might have something different. I will put my yak stacks. In the yak stacks, they have a little clip that holds the two yak stacks together. I'll undo that, so where I have that top yak stack going down into the crowd, and I'll set it high enough to where the bottom yak stack's going across their heads. So that bottom half of that yak will get back to that back square in the back. Does everyone understand that? And that stuff. So, and sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. On the speakers, they also have little on the little bracket that holds it to the speaker stand and the speaker-to-speaker stand. They have them four little holes in there and that stuff. And what you can do too is adjust them that hole to where that yak stack's going right straight down or right straight up or whatever you want to do in that stuff. So, but that's what I would do for a small festival. If you're in a small hall and you got a yak stack and you're in a smaller room, put the half a yak, you put the full yak up there, but only use the top half. 9 times out of 10, you'll get some guy out there that's an expert, and he'll sit there and say, you got nothing coming out of the bottom half, and you sit there and, yep, I do. but that's just, it's just so, so with that in mind, just all you really need is half yak and that stuff. So, but so with that in mind, on the flyer here, on the pamphlet I got here, it comes right out of from the yak stack itself. On the first page you have here, it has your just what I was talking about, to where you have the both side yaks pointing towards the middle, and that front yak pointing just a little off a dead center, going right straight back, and that stuff. So, and then mostly, and you see on the bottom of the hat, the yaks are almost directly straight across from each other. So, any questions on that? Do you have any concerns or? So, with that,
I'd like to add a little something to that front page there. If you look at the very right side and kind of turn it 90 degrees, and then take a peek at that, they're kind of showing you how to set the elevation of that yak and how many degrees to kind of let that angle down. Sound decays in an unusual way. It kind of fans out like a flashlight. And as that sound's coming out, if I direct it directly down at Scott here in the front row, like I said earlier, I'd peel his face off before I could ever get sound to the people in the back. So he talked about getting that up in the air. Well, absolutely, I want to get it up in the air, but now the sound's too far away from Scott. So if I bring it up and then angle it, as it decays, it's about relative to everybody throughout the hall. And that's what they're trying to show you on that part of the drawing.
There is if you bought a yak stack a long time ago, I don't know where Paul puts these out or not, but they give you a equation for how many feet going to the back of the hall, how many inches off that top wall or that back wall you have to come across. Say you got 50 feet from the speakers to the back of the wall, and it tells you in this equation to go up, say, 4 or 5 inches off that bottom of that back floor. That's the way you should have that yak stack going, and that's what shows you on the bottom of this, what he come through and said. So, is there any questions on that? Yeah. Real good question. That's a good question. When you got your, I should have brought one of them dang things along with me, but on the back end of the yak, I'm going to turn. Really?
You're going to lose the recording.
No, I'm not.
You're not?
Not right now.
Oh, okay.
I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to just turn it off so I walk in front of it.
Oh,
Whenever you, there's another thing, right use. As square dance callers, take another microphone along with you when you're calling, because you always get these presidents go out there and say, I need to make an announcement and that stuff. I never let people use my mic. I'm scared to use this one. So, but this guy had a cold, and I had a festival coming up, and sure enough, I caught his cold because he grabbed my mic and used it before I could get to him. Carry another mic with you and that stuff. And also have the presidents know where to stand when they use their mics. They don't want to come out in front because I tell you what, squeals will blow a speaker. But to get back to your question, how you do that, there's a bracket we put on the back of this yak, okay? It's got 4 holes, and there's a stud that comes out of the bottom. Have you seen them before? Okay. What you do is you adjust them studs, that stud, that little post that comes out of there, to one of them 4 holes to achieve your angle to going down, to take that measurement off that back wall.
So you would just use
One of the studs, yes. That's what. And then you would have that each time you move that, that changes the angle of your yak stack that goes on your speaker stand. Each time you move that post off on that connector. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there is. The bracket you're talking about goes on the back of the Somebody
Here.
give him a mic
Here.
so they can hear him.
Phil Morehouse from Redfield, Arkansas. When we're talking about what he's talking about is there's a post that you put in the stand itself, not the one that hooks onto the back of the speaker. You do both the back of the speaker brackets, but if you look, there's 3 other holes that are in the top of your bracket that you can adjust it forward and back, and that will change the amount of angle. So, yeah. So you just change that post itself. That's what he's talking about.
Thank you, Phil. All right. But then that takes care of that. Any questions on placement of the speakers or anything like that? All right. Moving on. On the second page, you see a yak stack wiring diagram. A lot of times what we do here, I tell you what, can you take this order with series in the parallel and the ohms and that stuff with that? And that? Talk about that.
So if you're looking, excuse me, if you're looking at that second front page there, and you're seeing the yak stack apart, you're like seeing inside the yak stack. The earlier yak stacks, and I can't tell you for sure of the latest and greatest incarnation of yak stack, but the earliest ones, each one of those speaker elements were 3.2 ohms. And if you're not familiar with the term ohms, ohms is just the resistance in the circuit. It's the part that's opposing the flow of electricity. You buy that for a bit? Okay. So if these were 3.2 ohms each, the way they wired them inside this cabinet, so one half of that yak stack, that's an entire stack, that top half and then the bottom half, within one half of a stack, there's 3 speaker elements, and they're wired in series. Well, okay, Scott, what the heck does series mean? Well, just like he was pointing out this series Y. When you put things in series, everything becomes additive. So every time I add a speaker in series, I'm increasing the resistance. I'm holding back the flow of electricity more. Is everybody good with that? Well, if we get our resistance too... Oh, yeah, feel free. This is a series Y that we're passing around for the tape. If you get resistance too low, current, amps, gets too high. When that resistance gets really high, what happens is we burn up amplifiers. The amplifier can only put out so much power. And if our resistance is too low, the power gets out of control and it burns itself up. Fortunately, in the MA220, it has a circuit in it designed that when it senses the current gets too high and it's about to cook itself, it shuts itself off. The MA150 does not do that. If you had an MA150 and you had the wrong load to the amplifier, it could burn it up. The 220 will shut itself off to protect itself. I think that's a good thing, personally. Well, anyway, so back to your drawing here. See if I can use this marker. When you're dealing with series, anytime you're dealing with series, all the elements would add together. So if I had 3.2 ohm individual speakers and I put them in series, 3.2 ohms times 3 gives me 9.6 ohms. Is everybody cool with that? 9.6 ohms. So that one half of this stack by itself, if you plugged it into the amplifier, would be 9.6 ohm load. That's acceptable. You know, you want as low as you can get without dropping below the threshold. If this says 4 ohms is what it's rated at, we don't want to drop below 4 ohms. Am I making sense? I want to get as close to that 4 without going under it as I can. I hope that makes sense. So within that stack, we have 9.6 ohms. Well, what we wire these typically with is a parallel Y to connect this half to that half. Parallel's a whole other animal. And as long as you're using the same exact type of speaker, math is very simple. If you're using combinations of speakers, not so simple. Okay? Bob's got a parallel Y there, just like what you would plug in the back of your yak.
Yeah, that's the reason I was going to say. I'm glad you took it.
So you can kind of see how it works in there. So if I had 9.6 in the top half, and I had 9.6 in the bottom half, and I put the two together in parallel, the rules for parallel, if you're using the exact same resistance values, is it's just a division problem. Where I used multiplication here, we would use division this time. So I have two 9.6 elements, so it'd be 9.6 divided by 2. And that's how parallel works. And it shows that in the later sheets there for you if you get a question. If you had 3 9.6 elements and they were all in parallel, you'd be down to 3.2 ohm load. If you had 4, it'd be 2.4. Am I making sense any? So whatever the resistance value of the single unit divided by the number of units. Okay? That's how parallel works. So our 4.8, I'm not a great writer, especially on an angle. So we would have 4.8 ohms if we had a full yak stack with a parallel Y plugged into one jack of this amp. Well, that's really good. I'm pretty close to that 4 ohms, and I didn't drop below it. All should be right with the world. What would happen if I took 2 of these stacks and I plugged one into this jack and another one into the other jack? This is a parallel connector in the back end of this amp. It's a parallel connector. So if I got a 4.8 in one spot and a 4.8 in the other spot, following my rules, what would it be? 2.4 ohms, below the 4 ohm threshold. That thing would burn up, this one would shut off. So what would we have to do in that case? I'd have to put a series. So now I got a 4.8 stack and a 4.8 stack. I've got 2 of them. Series I'm going to multiply 4.8 times 2 because I got 2 of them. Are you starting to see where I'm going with this? And I'm back to 9.6. Life is good. And that's all written in that paperwork there. Anywhere where it said A was the adapter, that's a parallel. Everywhere where it said S, that was a series. So as you look at those different combinations of hookups, that's what they're trying to tell you. Okay? Does that get you kind of on the right track, Bob?
That's good.
Awesome.
Awesome. That's why they asked me to do this thing, and they said Scott Bennett was going to be Scott's profession is electronics. This man knows everything about it. If you have any questions, that's why. Thank you, Lord. But so, is there any question on that? But what he said, to reiterate, we were at the Iowa convention, and my cohort had 2 sets of yaks. Well, on the main channel, and I came up afterwards. I didn't double check him and that stuff. The biggest things, if you want to run 2 sets of yaks off of an amplifier, one out of the main channel, one out of the monitor channel, and down here in the front, there's a little switch that goes from separate to tandem, combined, and then once you do that in the festival, put something over top of it so the callers can't touch it, because by gosh, they will touch it and that stuff. They will touch it, and they'll sit there and what's callers? They can't leave knobs alone. So lots of times what we do on our turntables that we have set in, we put in halls, we'll put little arrows. Let's see on this one, it's got a little arrow. You don't turn it past 7 o'clock and that stuff. So, the connections, if you wanted to use, and the one thing's good about the turntables compared to the MAs, if you're calling a dance and all of a sudden you have no music or you got a big old audible hum, on MA, if you don't have another MA, you're messed. You're screwed. With a turntable, you have a monitor channel in there, and all you got to do is take that speaker out of that main channel and put it in the monitor channel, and come down here and put down on tandem, and you're back up going again, and that stuff. One of the things that these MAs, we had one of the conventions sit there and say we want all MAs in our convention center. I had a nice, as Jerry would say, come to Jesus meeting with them. These two turntables in the 100s are the same thing as this MA. The only difference is it's got a turntable on it, and the thing of it is, we told these people that you can't. There's still them callers out there that has that record, and it's like saying, Mr. Caller, did you still use them records? You can't call our convention, and that's just not right. That's the way that my co-owner and I, we feel that we can't do that. So we had a nice meeting with them, and they see it our way. So, but one of the biggest things with the MA we were talking about, where on the 220, if you have to go and use multiple speakers with an MA and that stuff, you use a slave. You get yourself a shielded cable with an RCA male jack on one end and a 1/4-inch jack, male jack, on the other end. And I'm going to show you, if you want to stand up and walk around. I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I'll do it.
Come on up and look at what Bob's got going on.
All right. When you slave, you use the MA, you come out of the high side of this with the RCA back here in the back. You got RCA jacks back here in the back. You got a low side, which is on the bottom, a high side on the top. You come out of the high side on that. You take it down, and with the 1/4-inch jack, you plug that into your microphone on your slave amplifiers, which sets underneath the table. That's where I would, if I'm slaving a MA, I put it underneath the table. Some people will put it in a different room. I can't understand why would you do that, but some people would do that.
Well, one thing to consider, and you notice that the cord Bob is using there is pretty short.
Right.
And that's partly intentional. But if you don't use a good shielded cable, that thing's like an antenna for noise. Every single thing. Somebody walk by with a GSM-style cell phone, and they'll be able to hear it in your loudspeakers. Right. So, I mean, you need to be sure it's a good shielded cabling, and don't run it any further than you have to.
Right. The shorter the better. That's what my wife says. Easy. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, where was I? Okay, got this one plugged into the high output on the back end of the MA. Plug it into the microphone channel number 1 on your slave. Turn your tone knob all the way counterclockwise. All the way to counterclockwise. So it's bassy. All right? And so what you do is it's from right there you have your volume set on your MA, you set your volume on your slave, and you go out and you listen to your speakers and make sure when I do it, I'll have 2 yaks. I'll have 2 full yaks, and I'll have them set on maybe on a stage or something like that. And I'll walk. I'll get out about maybe 40 feet out, 30 feet out, and I'll walk when I hear this one, and I'll walk across until I hear this one. Say I'm not even in the halfway across the stage, and I just hear this one. I know that I've got to put more sound out on this one. So what I'll do is have somebody that's sitting, usually my wife will sit there and she'll be helping me out. And I'll say, okay, turn the volume on the slave up a little bit more. And I'll come back. I'll start listening. And then I'll come over here. And once I get to that middle of the stage and I hear the same amount of voice and music coming out of this speaker and sailing out of this speaker, I'm good. I'm good. And then once that happens, everything that comes out of this, your volume control, everything comes out of this MA. You turn the music off. The slave amplifier goes off, and the whole music shuts down. You use your volume control. It'll go up and down just like everything. So everything is copacetic. Is that right? So do you have a question? Why full bass? Because Hilton says so.
Well, I can answer that to some degree. I said before the show started this morning that when Jim Hilton designed the microphone preamp, he rolled out most of the bass at say we'll call it the 12 o'clock position of the tone control. So you have just a little bit of change back and forth this way. Well, if you want to get it back to a standard input, you got to bring it full bass.
So that was good. Frank, hold on a second.
Now, just reading over this, you were saying on the MA to come off of the high side if you're slaving, but on here it's talking about coming off the low side. Is this a turntable?
Turntable.
Okay.
I come off the high side. I come off the high side and that stuff with the MA. Now, I'm sorry, I should have read that over a little bit. I've always used slave on the high sides and that stuff. If it's on there, cross out the high side, the low side, and put it in the high side.
You have more control over the volume if you do that.
Yeah.
On the high side, right?
So let's see. Is there any questions? We got some time here. Is there any questions on the equipment, equipment usage or speakers or anything that we could have? You got a question? Sure.
Dennis for our Sun City, West Arizona. Got a question for you. A lot of the festivals that are around this area, I don't know about the other areas, but they use gyms for their festivals because they're larger halls, and they can even have wood floors because they're basketball courts. How do you sound a hall that's got bricks all the way around it? And because you talk about the echo when you clap, I mean, it's ridiculous. How would you set up your sound to eliminate as much echo as you can?
Well, lots of times we have a gymnasium back in Illinois that's the same thing. I sound it from the side, and then I go from basket to basket. I put these little flags type of things, shooting that into that. It seems to help. Lots of times, too, is as we as callers have to watch the volume controls on our voices and our music. Less is more, and there you go, and that stuff. That's might help.
I'd have a comment or two to
Go
add
ahead.
to that.
Go
The very first thing that I always do, especially if it's a really chaotic hall as far as echo, reverberation, whatever you want to call it, is never, ever allow a speaker to go against a flat wall, because you need to change that angle of reflection to where it's not coming back through the hall. That's really, really tough. If you look even on the front of the yak stack paper, part of the thing that he's trying to tell you is to move the speaker away from the center line and aim it back towards the center line. Well, that prevents you from being able to blast it against the back wall and it reflect back through. It's going to hit that wall at an angle. It's going to hit the next wall at an angle, and so on. The other thing is, I heard it said over here, was it Philip? Less is more.
Yeah.
Don't add a whole bunch of speakers, and certainly don't crank them up. You know, you need to keep that kind of under control. It can get pretty chaotic. In a bad hall like that, some things like Bob mentioned about hanging some things to kind of break up that reflection is a good thing.
One of the first, I'll get to you, one of the first conventions that my partner Tom Manning and I, we own Solid Gold Sound, we did a convention up in Minnesota on an ice curling rink. Oh my gosh, it was so bad. We listened, we made a mistake. We listened to one of the callers up there because we were just one of our first conventions, and we listened to the callers. He says, yeah, just put speakers all the way down this one side, and you'll be good. Oh my God, it was the worst. Bob, you were there. And it was so bad. We worked so hard to find out which way. We all of a sudden said, on Saturday morning, Friday night, you could not hear. Nobody was going over there and dancing in that hall. Saturday morning, we put one speaker, one end, and shot it right down the end. It was perfect. Less is more. But Bob was up there and that stuff, and his wife was chewing my ear, saying, "We got a better sound in here than that." So, but that's less is more, and something like that, you get a lot of reverberation and something like that. Less is more. That's good. Go ahead. I'll get to you.
I remember some of you may know Marv Lindner. He was a good friend of mine, and he was calling a festival out here for a club in Chandler, and I couldn't make the Friday night dance. I went over for the workshop, but the Friday night dance was terrible because they did that. What they did was they put a speaker down the hall. They used the old Hilton, big Hilton horns. Put a speaker down one side, speaker down the end on the other side, and then a speaker coming back to where the caller was calling. So Marv asked me, he says, "Dennis, what do I do?" And it was one of those fallout shelters, gyms. And I said, well, and he had an old static mic. I don't know if you remember the old little statics. It was really bassy, made you sound sexy. I said, well, you're not going to like this, but I'm going to give you a 635A. He says, I don't want that. I said, do you want me to help you with the sound or not? So he used my 635A, and the crowd cheered at the Square Dance Workshop because they could actually hear.
All right. Scott.
A couple. My name is Scott Byers. I'm from Sacramento, California, and a couple of things that I actually three things that I've seen that I've done and have worked wonderful for problems of echo halls. One of them is very complicated and takes quite a bit of knowledge to do. Two of them are pretty easy. One of which there's a hall in Colorado that they're no longer using, but it was a deaf school. And it was the most heavily reverberated hall I've ever been in my life. I mean, you clapped your hands, and it was still echoing the next day. I mean, it was that bad. So what I did was I took one speaker, and I put it against the wall, facing towards the wall, 6 inches from the wall. And what that did was, essentially, it turned the entire room into the inside of a speaker. And it got rid of that reverberation completely. to do that. That's one thing. The other thing that I've seen is diopposed speakers, one on one side, one on the other, and they reverse the polarity of one of the speakers, and then that way by the time the sound got there, it sounded fine in the center and all around, and that was another thing. Those are two simple things. The complicated one is one that Scott Pierce and I both use, and we were both taught by Dick Cook, who is an engineer in the Sacramento area, and that is we delay the sound. And the object is as you get to a certain point, you delay the sound of that set of speakers, and then move another set and delay the sound back to there. Now, Scott uses kind of a complicated arrangement, and he's got to go through a whole bunch of instructions to do it. I'm a simple mind, so I use a little thing called a Behringer Shark. It's a DSP 110. And what I do with that is I just say, okay, how many feet between this speaker, from the front of this speaker to that speaker, and I plug it into my DSP 110, and it does the calculation for me and sets what the reverberation. But again, those you have to be very careful of because you have to actually measure from the front of one to the other in order to get that delay to work. The object behind it is as that wave hits, you now have delayed the sound so that the new wave that's starts at the exact same time that wave hits, and it doesn't sound like a reverberation. We're fooling the dancers into believe that there's no reverberation in the hall.
Be careful, obviously. He mentioned that middle one that he mentioned, where you have one speaker in the front of the hall, have one in the back, and it's aimed at it. He perfectly told you. So be careful with that. Listen to what he said. You have to flip the phase. The two speakers can't be driving at each other. That doesn't work. One has to be driving and the other one has to be pulling back. So it's like this. If they're going like this, it will be more chaotic in the center. It won't work. Just watch that. Make it worse.
You know, one of the things that I've seen over at if you have a speaker that you don't know what ohmage it is, Paul has got a little meter over there. You can plug it in the back end of your speaker and find out what ohmage is coming out of that speaker. That's a good tool to have for you square dance callers that you're going in. A lot of the halls have different kind of speakers and that stuff. Some halls, some guys set up speakers. Clubs set up speakers and that stuff, and you don't know what's coming out of that speaker. You got that little device, plug it in the back end of that thing and find out. Say, I'm not plugging into that and that stuff, because it's been known to happen that you're a traveling caller and you've come in and, oh, we got speakers set up for you. Yeah, okay, well, plug it in and find out which, if you don't, you'll blow a system.
What he's talking about specifically, if you have an ohm meter and you have one of these devices, and Paul sells some ohm meters, but he's created a little device that you can plug your speaker into with a cable and then easily get it connected to the ohm meter instead of you sitting there fighting with the leads trying to get on the speaker cable. It's just kind of like a quick little adapter to get from speaker plug, the 1/4-inch plug, to the ohm meter. That's kind of a cool device. It can kind of save you a little bit. Just a quick note, I don't want to turn this into a great big electronics class, but when you're talking direct current, all you have to worry about is ohms of resistance. If you're talking alternating current, there's so many more pieces to that puzzle, and we have to call that impedance. So when we're dealing with the sound that's coming out of the back end of this amplifier, it's an analog, and there's more to it than just resistance. But we don't all have impedance meters. So the closest we really can get is using the ohm meter to get us kind of in there. As the frequency goes up, frequency and pitch goes up, the resistance actually goes up. As it goes down, it goes down. Just a little added thought.
Do we have any questions? We got some time here. Well, we're almost out of time. Yes.
Yeah, David Holloway from Maui. This is really the first class or thing I've ever come to about sound. I'm a small thing, and I was just need a small 35 Hilton and 2 speakers are the most to cover anything I ever want to do. But yesterday I went to, or over the weekend, I went to the community dance program. And there was a guy named Wayne from Texas, Wayne Weston. Well, he showed us and demonstrated a rather unique system. He took one of those hearing enhancement and put it in the back of the room. And the same thing, he had to change. He said you have to change the phase, which I don't know much about, but he could cover a room, and he actually demonstrated it using that, and he adjusted it so that the whole room suddenly became one big sound system. And he had 4 speakers in the front and speakers in the back, and it just really did a good job. And I don't know, you people know more than I do, and may want to expand on this a little bit, but it worked for him, and it really worked for me yesterday.
Yeah, not saying that we're the experts. You guys are out there. You're in the trenches and that stuff. You know, we do what works for me and that stuff. I know, I was telling Scott the other night, I just know enough to get myself out of trouble and not get myself in trouble, and that's why it was so nice to have an electrical engineer sitting here next to me and that stuff. But any other questions? Let's see. Let's get with Scott back here.
Yeah, Scott Pierce from California. Question for you, for the guys who have used the opposing speakers in reversing the phase. How does the dancer's distance from each speaker impact the sound? Because, like, I use if I set speakers down the side, I use a delay so that the sound gets there at the same time. Since the sound is coming out of each set of speakers at the same time, is there a delay problem when a dancer is 2/3 of the way back in the hall?
They're going to be within their own cone, I'll call it, of sound. And so at the very center, you're kind of catching a little bit of both, but because they're out of phase, it doesn't cause a cancellation or a destructive wave. I'll call it that.
Yeah, Phil Morehouse from Arkansas. 2 questions. One, I mean, the phase delays, one of the things I've done to phase delays is just equal length cables. And that's one of the ways I fought the phase delay. And the other way, I don't know if that's an appropriate method, but that's one way I've done it. And the other thing is, can you expand a little on the normal and tandem? I've saved myself. I think I lost my normal amplifier, and I went to tandem, but I don't know what the 2 are used for.
Well, that's really good. So you've got like a 300 amp. Okay. So any of the 300 amps, they had 2 amplifiers built into one system. And one we called the main and one we called the monitor. When you put it in tandem, you're telling both amplifiers to be on and drive speaker elements. That's what you're asking. But under one set of controls. As opposed to having a monitor set and a main set, you're driving everything off the main set of controls.
And I'm actually going one above it. I'm kind of using it as a slave. So when I lost my normal...
It bridges the amplifier.
Yeah, when I lost my normal, my output, my RCA output wasn't functioning.
Okay.
And so when I went to the tandem, it bridged the amplifiers and became functioning again.
And your first assumption may be correct, that one of your amplifiers may be down. And just by turning it on to tandem, you brought online the other amplifier. Yeah. Great question.
Another thing to answer that question, when I was a little kid, I spent a lot of time with Jim Hilton. And Jim would sit me up while he was working on all the sets. What I found out was the monitor amplifier board that plugs in and out is identical to the main. So if you pull that monitor amp and put it into the main slot, it's going to run like normal. Yeah, you just open it up and swap those two cards, or take one of the cards out. You won't have a monitor circuit anymore or a monitor amp. You'll just have the main amp. But that's one thing I learned on that.
Done that before.
I have an interesting question, and that is something that I just found out recently. One of my students in one of my class, I forgot to say, Scott Byers, Sacramento, California. If you go through the volume control, there is a mono plug in there. If you plug into that, it bypasses the equalization that Jim Hilton put into the sets, and you get pure sound coming out. It's very, very tinny, but you get that. Why is it that we can do that? That's a question I never got a chance to ask because I didn't know about that.
The short answer is that all you're doing when you hook that remote music into that jack is you're interconnecting into the preamp. And you're causing a change in resistance, which is telling the preamp to come up and come down. If you take that out and you just put a signal into that, well, it's putting it right in line with the amplifier.
Scott Byers again, does it cause any problem to the amplifier if you do that?
I would be concerned a little bit depending on the output of the device that you're driving that with. Because you have to remember that's like, microphone level. And in the output of a device, even my phone, would be much higher than that. Right. You could actually blow a transistor in the preamp.
It was so weird because one of my students said, "Here, try this," and plugged it right in, and all of a sudden the music's coming out, and I'm going, "I would never have believed that worked in a million years."
I would be extremely careful with that.
So it's like, yeah, don't try this.
Got a question back here?
Seth Levine, Tempe, Arizona. So I heard this weekend for the first time that 2 half yaks are different from 2 halves of a full yak. And I didn't think that was true, but...
No. That's not. Any other questions?
I have one more comment.
Go ahead.
About yak stacks. There have been so many versions of yak stacks over the years, different speaker configurations, different type speaker elements within them. Most of the early yak stacks, and I believe this one would fit, they intentionally reversed the polarity of these units. And the newer ones, perhaps, are wired in, we'll call it positive phase, and we'll call this one negative phase. If you have a new yak over here wired up and an older yak over here wired up, and you stand directly between the two elements, you'll get phase canceling just like your Bose phase canceling headphones. They get rid of the noise. The same effect happens. You have destructive wave interference, and they actually cancel each other out. And you wind up, I can hear this speaker, stand in the middle, I hear nothing. Absolutely nothing. Been there, done that. I carry what I call a little phase changer. It's just a female 1/4 inch to a male 1/4 inch that I've actually flipped the phase on. And I have that handy, and if I've got phase cancellation issues, I unplug one speaker, plug that in, plug it back in. I don't care which way it's going as long as they're going the same. Something to consider.
Anything else?
No other questions?
No other questions?
You guys have just been so good. I need to tell you, I'm impressed.
Thank you very much for coming out.
And I'll still be around if you want to field a question or two.
Nice
I
big
enjoy
hand for
talking
Scott.
about sound.
Nice big hand for
Nice
Scott.
hand for Bob Asp.
Thank you, guys.
Very good.